of Regency Era parents about to welcome a new baby into the world. But what are you going to name this child? Well, that is the question we're going to be discussing here today. We're going to be delving into the Georgian and Regency mindset behind how they chose their children's given Christian first names, whatever you want to call that name that's not your family name. And this will help us understand history better, and then also too, for all you people who like to write Regency-based novels, it'll help you name your characters too, because we're going to be delving into, of course, what the parents were thinking at the time, and likewise, you should have the same thoughts when naming your Regency era characters so that they'll be time period appropriate. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where I talk about classic literature and history. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. So let's really delve into the mindset behind the late Georgian and Regency era baby name choosing process. Now, parents had two routes, the traditional route and the fashionable/romantic route. So first up, let's talk about the traditional route. So where did a lot of traditional names at this time come from? Well, the number one source was, of course, religion and history. Of course, the people at this time period were very religious. They were predominantly Protestant Christian. Of course, this is after King Henry broke with the Pope, so we have the Church of England in power at the time. So a lot of the names came from the Bible. So this is why you see novels filled with people named Mary, Lydia, Martha, Matthew, because those are all very traditional Bible-based names. The next source of Christian names were saint names. Of course, earlier in history, when they were still part of the Roman Catholic Church, of course, naming your children after saints was much more important than it now was. However, during that time period, these saint names had become common, so now they were just common names in English society. And there's a lot of saint names that you wouldn't even think is actually a saint name, but is. Examples include Lucy, Catherine, and Dominic. Dominic, of course, coming from the word for Sunday in Latin, obviously not English, because there's no Dominic Sunday connection there. And of course, Lucy was named after a virgin saint who had her eyes put out. So all you Lucys out there, that's the origin of your name. And then of course there was Christian qualities like faith, hope, joy. During this time period, these were only seen in more non-traditional households. Maybe if you were like super religious, you would get one of these names. But they had been much more common in the 1600s, where we have that era, which I think is kind of famous, when people were giving their children whole sentence long names, like Fight Against Sin or We're Saved by Holy Salvation, you know, something like that. But that was in the 1600s, so everyone's moved away from that by the late Georgian and Regency era. So basically, unless these parents were like super religious and wanted to name their kid Faith, or another really super religious family would only name their kid something like Hezekiah or one of the lesser known Bible names. But more traditionally, we have, of course, the major Bible names like Mary, Martha, and the saint names that have passed into everyday use like Lucy and Catherine. Now, on the history side, of course, the Norman Conquest introduced a huge amount of French baby names into society, such as Eleanor. So those are the religious and history-based baby names they have to choose from. Now, of course, then there is the royal names, because of course the names of the royals became popular in everyday use. And this is where names like William, George, Charlotte, and Margaret really got their extra boost to everyone wanting to name their baby that, because they were the name of royals. And then of course, as there are the different houses of royals, they would all introduce their own sets of names, such as the Stuarts really made popular the names like Charles, Elizabeth, Mary, Frances, Anne, Catherine, and Jane. So they made those like top baby name picks by having themselves as royal. It's kind of like when celebrities name their baby something and then normal people all start naming their kid that too. The famous effect of names. And of course, a great example of this is Victoria. Victoria was actually a anglicized form of her mother's German name, and so it was not a popular name in England at the time until, of course, Queen Victoria became queen. Which was, of course, after the Regency era, so no Regency era parents are naming their kid Victoria. Okay, so those are like the traditional sets of names and where they come from. The Bible, saints, royals, Norman conquest, all of that. Now, the parents of the Regency era, though, did not just look through a baby name book if they were traditional parents and like pick one. What they did is they started looking at these names from more traditional family sources, the top one being relatives. So children were very often named after relatives or their godparents. In the north of England, it was common to name the first boy and girl after the father's parents, so like the grandparents, and then the second set of boy and girl, they had this many kids, after the mother's parents. And then after that, they would get more creative. You know, that's when it's like, oh, should we name this new one Henry or Charles? I don't know. I just look at the royal tree. Who should we name this one after? No rules. Do what you want now with younger kids. But really, each sort of region and family in England had their own way of honoring their relatives or the godparents. Of course, we see Jane Austen's own mother, Cassandra, was named after her aunt, who was married to the first Duke of Chandos. I think that's how you say it. And then, of course, Jane Austen's older sister, Cassandra, is named after her mom. So we see how this name is recurrent throughout family history, and that was very common. You had these same names just going over and over again, just like Jane Austen herself had her cousin Jane Cooper, and they were named after her Aunt Jane. And so these names were constantly recycled. And likewise, you would be named after a godparent. For example, Jane Austen's cousin Eliza named her son after her godfather, Warren Hastings. She named him Hastings. And of course, part of this naming your kid after their godparent was this hope that that godparent would then thereby be very attached to their namesake. And if this godparent was rich, the godparent would feel like, you know, some responsibility financially towards this child. That was one of the hopes when naming your kid after their rich godparent. And so like we see too here with Eliza naming her son's first name of Hastings after her godfather's last name of Hastings, that was another common thing, which is where we see a son getting a last name as a first name. And of course, the most famous example of this is Fitzwilliam Darcy. Of course, Fitzwilliam was his mother, Lady Anne's maternal last name. So that was another option. You could give your son a last name as a first name. And so if you were a very traditional family in Regency England, you would be looking at your relatives for names, and of course they would be more than likely these very traditional names based off of the Bible, saints, royalty, or history, and using those for your children's names. And of course you had a lot more leeway in younger children, so if you had 10 children by the last child, you can start getting more creative because you've ran out of people to name them after. But still, this huge attachment to tradition of so many types did result in a very limited number of names being reused over and over again. Oh, by the way, I always forget to ask this in my videos, but if you are enjoying this video, please gently press the like button to show your approval of this message. Now, if you're like a more adventurous, romantic, untraditional family, you had the second pathway for naming your child, which I am calling the romantic, fashionable mindset. So in the upper classes of the late 1700s up through around 1820, there was this interest in having more pretty, romantic names for your children. And these were drawn from a few different sources. One was, of course, literature. Major novels of the time gave us some great girls' names like Clarissa, Pamela, Belinda, that people were starting to name their daughters. Then there was this move towards using French versions or Italian versions of very common names to sort of like spice them up, because names like Amelia and Ophelia just sounded so romantic and poetical. Of course, French was giving these upper classes names like those, also names like Cordelia and Sylvia and Chloe. Meanwhile, they started also using the very poetic Italian versions of names. So instead of naming their daughter plain old Alice, she would become Alicia. Olive would become Olivia, and Lucy would become Lucinda. There was a lot of adding like this, A or IA, because of this onto a lot of very common names. So you got these more like refined versions of them. And of course, there was this House of Hanover now in power at the monarchy, and they were inspiring some very popular names, where even though the names from other royals had become popular, because these were the new royals, it was like more fashionable, right? Like this is names of today royalty. So there, of course, we have stuff like Augustus, Ernest, Frederica, Frederick, Louisa, Sophia, and Amelia. So these names were also becoming popular because they were the new happening royal names. And then, of course, we saw this trend of having double names, like Jane Austen's nephew, James Edward, had two names, James Edward. Of course, it wasn't uncommon for the higher classes to have multiple middle names per se, but James Edward was literally called James Edward in everyday life. It was like a compound first name. So really this fashionable romantic trend among the higher classes of having these very flowery names was super popular again at the end of the 1700s and up through 1820. But then, like all trends, the exact opposite happens. And after 1820, there started to be this pullback from these flowery names where it was like, no, that's like affected. That's like too much. We need simple names. It's very interesting how there was this shift from like, yes, flowery is good to almost flowery is bad. And we see that how it was viewed in this negative light in Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. So if you're familiar with that novel, the main character's name is Molly, which is a form of Mary. She was named after her mother. So here we have super traditional happening. Now her dad decides to marry this new woman, and her name is Hyacinth Clare, and her daughter's name is Cynthia. So can you get more flowery than that? Not in the Victorian times. This is really interesting, the words they use when reacting to these names. When talking about Cynthia, the dad of the family says, Cynthia seems to me such a out-of-the-way name, only fit for poetry, not for daily use. So again, we see like this not so much flowery names anymore in the Victorian era. And then it's interesting too, when the dad breaks it to Molly that her new stepmom's name is Hyacinth. She's like, Hyacinth? Said Molly, entirely bewildered. She's bewildered by Hyacinth here. And he says, yes, Hyacinth is the silliest name I've ever heard, but it's hers, and I must call her by it. I just think it's so funny how they're reacting to these flowery names, but it does go along with this reverse trend after 1820 back to more simple names. So those are the two major schools of thought parents had while naming their kids in the Georgian and Regency era. Did they want to go the traditional religious and family route, or did they want to go with the poetical, romantic, fashionable trend that was happening at the time? So if you are per se writing a Regency novel and you're naming your characters, it would be good to really think out, what are their families like? What's the parents' mindset? Are they traditional? Are they more romantic? Because I think sometimes there's this trend for people just to be like, I'm gonna name everyone Mary and Jane and Catherine. That's it. Super safe here. But not everyone really was named those things back in the time. Of course, they were very common. You name someone Jane, no one's going to be like, this is historically inaccurate. But you do have a wider set of names you can name people. And you can use this to express things about them. For example, like, do they have a rich godparent they're named after? Are their parents all romantic and poetical? Are they a younger child? Because remember, again, after they get so many godparents and parents and grandparents named after, and they're like the 10th kid, who knows what name they're getting at that point. They get really creative then. That's another thing to keep in mind if you're writing a Regency novel, is to check the name usage at the time of whether it was a boy's name or girl's name. And then of course, just one other thing to pay attention to is the spelling. There were a lot of different ways to spell common names. Of course, if you look at Eleanor Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility, she spells her name differently than Eleanor Tilney in Northanger Abbey. So here, even Jane Austen is using two different versions of Eleanor in different novels. And of course, you just would want to avoid like super modern, crazy spellings of names. So that is what was going through the minds of all those Regency parents when they were picking out names for the adorable little new baby. Let me know in the comments below what you would want your name to be if you lived in Regency times. Thank you so much for watching my video. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where I talk about classic literature and history. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. Bye! Let me know in the comments below what you would want your name to be if you lived in Regency times. I think I would want to be, I actually have no clue. This is such a hard question. What is the answer? For some reason, Amelia is coming to mind and I don't even know why. But apparently I'm gonna be Amelia if I lived in Regency times.